Hi, I'm Dr. Jason Fung. Today I'm going to be talking about the different types of carbohydrates and how it can have an effect on weight loss, that is fast carbs versus slow carbs, and how you should be making your food choices. And it's coming right up. When we're talking about diet for weight loss, we often focus on single variables. For example, calories. So if you have 100 calories, for example, people might say that, oh, calories are calories, so 100 calories of cookies is as fattening as 100 calories of broccoli. And this is not true. And insulin is really the key hormone here that tells our body to gain or lose weight. And the hormones are really the chemical messengers that tell us what to do. So the foods affect the hormones, which affects our body fatness if we're talking about weight. And if you have different foods but have the same calories, they will have very, very different hormonal effects and therefore have different effects on our body weight. So the cookies, for example, are just much more fattening than eating eggs, for example. So the next step is some people really focused on carbohydrates versus proteins and fats, which is so-called macronutrients, because carbs tend to stimulate insulin much more than, say, dietary fat. So people would eat a low carbohydrate diet, and that is very effective for a lot of people. But the different types of carbohydrates can also have different hormonal effects. So 100 grams of carbohydrates, depending on what kind it is, can have different effects. And it's really, we're talking about fast carbohydrates versus slow carbohydrates here, because the different types of carbohydrates, and we classify them by something called the glycemic index. The glycemic index, or GI, is a measure of how much glucose effect that those carbohydrates have. When we digest and absorb glucose very fast, then we're going to get a very high rise in glucose. If it's much more slowly absorbed, then the rise is much slower, and therefore the glycemic index is slower. Dr. David Ludwig of Harvard did a very good study looking at the effect of glycemic index on real-world outcomes. And what he did was he took a group of participants and gave them 3 different types of breakfast. A low carb diet breakfast, which was a vegetable omelet, which was about 40% carbohydrates. A medium glycemic index breakfast, which was 64% carbohydrates. And these were steel-cut oats. And steel cut oats are cut in a way that preserves a lot of the original structure, and therefore, because it's a little bit more hard to digest, gets absorbed a little bit slower than the high glycemic index breakfast, which was instant oats. And instant oats are pulverized to a very fine dust so that when you pour hot water on them, it becomes ready, which is why they're instant. But because they're very finely ground, our bodies are able to absorb it much easier, and therefore the glucose spike is higher. So as expected, you can see that there is a big difference in terms of the glucose, and because of the glucose going up very high in the high glycemic index group, you also have a very high insulin spike. And the insulin is what drives the glucose into cells and tells our body to start storing some of this glucose as energy, either in our liver or as body fat. And insulin, of course, drives a lot of weight gain. So not only do you have this expected effect, but have a look at what happens a few hours after you eat. Because of this massive spike in insulin, what you get is that all the glucose in the blood has gone into storage, and therefore the blood glucose goes much lower than you expect, much lower than you were before you even ate. And that's going to give you symptoms of hunger and hypoglycemia. And the low glycemic index shows a very small rise, which is more sustained over time, and no huge drop as you saw before. The total glucose effect can be measured by adding up the area under this curve, and that's the total effect that you're expected to see of this food on how much glucose you're going to take in. And when you compare the high versus the low, you see almost 4 times the effect, which is expected. But what's a shock is that when you compare the high versus medium, which remember is the same food and the same number of carbohydrates, you have almost double the effect on the glucose area under the curve, or AUC. You can look at glucagon, which is almost the opposite of insulin in the way that when insulin is trying to force glucose into cells, glucagon tells you to take the energy back out, whereas insulin blocks fat burning, glucagon is going to increase fat burning. And again, you see with the higher carbohydrate diets that the glucagon is going to fall, whereas the vegetable omelet, you're going to see this rise in glucagon. After breakfast, the participants would log their hunger scores on a visual scale. And what you can see is that at all time points, the hunger is much higher when you're eating more carbohydrates compared to lower carbohydrates. And this is for the same number of calories. So even though you're taking the same amount of energy in terms of calories, you're much hungrier and not as full. And this effect is sustained through the entire 4 or 5 hours after eating. So if you're eating breakfast at 7 or 8 in the morning, you're much more hungry throughout the day. And this is completely in keeping with our clinical experience. That is, if you eat a lot of protein, like a vegetable omelet or steak and eggs, you're going to be full right through till lunchtime. But if you're eating instant oats, or you're eating 2 slices of white bread with jam, by 10:30, you're going to be ravenous. You're going to be more hungry than you were if you didn't eat breakfast. Why? Because your glucose has gone below the baseline, and now you're feeling the effects, and you really feel like you need something to eat. So you go got yourself, say, a low-fat muffin, which starts the cycle all over again. What the study did then was give them a buffet lunch, and they could eat whatever they wanted. And at that point, the researchers would measure how much people ate. And the strongest predictor of how much people ate at lunchtime, and remember that they all ate the same number of calories at breakfast, was the area under the curve of glucose, which again, for the high glycemic index, is much higher. And comparing the high glycemic index to the low glycemic index, those people who had the instant oats ate 81% more calories at the subsequent lunch. So eating the calories wasn't what made the difference. It was the hormones that made the difference. And if you compare high glycemic index versus medium, which is the same food but different preparation, the area under the curve, which was higher, which resulted in those instant oat group eating 53% more calories at lunchtime. And that's going to have a huge effect, because people always think, oh, it's about calories in, calories out, but that's really not the issue. If you are hungry, you're going to have a higher desire to eat, which is going to make you eat more or make worse food choices. You're going to get the fries instead of the salad, for example. And that's what's going to drive your weight gain. The insulin. That's the key here. So what you see is that the root cause is the hunger. When you're trying to lose weight, it's not about controlling the calories, because all 3 arms start out at the same calories. The idea is that you have to control the hunger. Certain foods are going to leave you hungry and certain foods are not. If you are going to take some carbohydrates, what you should focus is on the low glycemic index. And this is available anywhere. If you go online, you can find a huge list of glycemic index. But in general, the refined carbohydrates that are highly processed are the ones that cause the highest weight gain.